This is class 4 of the series, Religious Paradigms, Believing Our Worldview. And as in every class so far, the following conjecture was presented. If the Bible is true, then there should be evidence of that truth to be found in the world. The evidence presented this morning comes from the following sources. From the DVD, True You number 2, Is the Bible Reliable? With Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. Episode 1, The Patriarchal Narratives and the Documentary Hypothesis. From the book, Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas. Part 2, The Stones Will Cry Out. From the DVD, Beyond is Genesis History, Volume 3, Bible and Stars. Del Tackett is interviewing the archaeologist Dr. Doug Petrovich. From the DVD, Buried Secrets of the Bible with Albert Lynn, Episode 2, Sodom and Gomorrah, the last 10 minutes, because that's the only time that he actually goes to the place where we're going to be looking at. From the book, Return of the God Hypothesis by Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. In this book, Dr. Meyer explains that in the 1800s, materialistic philosophy claimed that the only things that were real were matter, energy, and the laws of nature. It claimed that there were no such things as God, spirits, or miracles which would violate the laws of nature. As a result of this philosophy, some people began to accept the belief that the Bible was just a collection of myths and fairy tales. From the DVD, True You number 2, in 1878, that's AD, our time, Julius Wellhausen launched what came to be called textual higher criticism. He had previously proposed an evolutionary theory of religion, that religion first had a pantheistic phase, followed by a polytheistic phase, followed by a monotheistic phase, and of course, in his case, finally no God at all. Then he proposed the evolution of the Bible, that the Bible, specifically the Torah, the first 5 books, had been written and edited by many different human authors up to 1,000 years later. This so-called documentary hypothesis dated the writing of the Torah from 800 to 500 BC, instead of being written by Moses before 1406 BC. I don't know if everybody understands the dating. BC means before Christ, before year 1. AD. AD means Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord, which means after Jesus was born. BC is before Christ. So they start counting time when you say BC backwards from Christ in reverse order. So the bigger the numbers, the farther you are away from Christ in either direction. It's kind of like the number line where you have 0 and then you have minus numbers and plus numbers. Wellhausen's stated objections to the Bible were, number 1, that different names for God in the text required different authors, and number 2, that there was no evidence from outside the Bible to support it. However, although unstated, his greatest objection to the Bible was probably due to his materialistic worldview that miracles and God were simply impossible. He dated the writings of the Torah by supposedly different authors as J for Yahwist or Jehovah from 850 BC, as E for Elohist or Elohim from 750 BC, as D for Deuteronomical from 651 BC, supposing that King Josiah did not find the lost law, but that he and others had made it up instead, and as P for the priestly code from 570 to 530 BC. This disbelief in the truth of the biblical account carried over well into the 1900s, but from the middle of the 1800s through today, evidence has continued to mount that the details of the Bible are indeed factual. For example, I'm going to use pictures of the pyramid-like ziggurats from Beyond is Genesis History, Volume 3, Bible and Stars. The biblical account of the Tower of Babel, beginning in Genesis 11, says the following. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, which means confusion, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. End quote. But you know, it seems like everywhere they went, they carried with them the same ideas for building these ziggurat temples. And yet more ziggurats. I don't know if you can see this on the screen, but there are like 4 arrows pointing up, left, right, and down. That's north, west, east, and south from a little place called Eridu. Archaeologists call it the Uruk expansion. Uruk was a little town right next to Eridu, because they went north, south, east, and west from there, leaving a base of a great tower in the city of Eridu. The base of the tower was said to be a 1/4 mile square. The tower was said to have been completed many centuries later by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and that probably should not be surprising, since I think he built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And if you recall the story in the Old Testament, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Look at this Babylon which I built for my own glory." And the angel came down and said, "That's enough." And he was cast out of his kingdom for 7 years to live like a beast in the field. And as they left, the people leaving this area, they all carried the knowledge of how to make the same pottery. The bevel-edged bowl in the left picture was very common. It was made by pressing clay into a mold in a kind of a bowl factory, and they could still see the fingerprints of people who pressed the clay in the clay. The spouted jars in the upper right were also common. These are only the small jars. Large spouted jars, which were used for things like wine or beer, had spouts which they curved down to keep the beer from spoiling. Scientists in our day and age did not learn until the 1700s that the germs carried by dust or drops in the air do not travel up into a downward pointed spout. So it took us a long time to realize that's where the mold and the germs and stuff were coming from, which spoiled things. As the people arrived at new places, they either built for the first time on virgin sites, that is, there was no city or anything underneath it, or they completely wiped out the previous occupants, or they lived near the previous occupants but did not intermingle with them, possibly because they did not speak the same language. As they left and went different directions, they developed different methods of writing. Some used pictographs, shown on the left, others used cuneiform, shown in the middle, and others used hieroglyphics, shown on the right, and some eventually invented different alphabets to make writing even simpler. But what else does the Bible say about this event, that is, the confusion of the languages? Genesis 10, verse 8 says, begin quote, Cush, who happened to be the grandson of Noah, begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And at the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. End quote. Did he leave his kingdom because God confounded the languages? It goes on to say, begin quote, from that land he went to Assyria, which is kind of north of there, and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. That is the principal city, end quote. The archaeologist Doug Petrovich from the Oriental Institute of Chicago, Illinois, says that all the evidence points to Nimrod being the same person as Sargon of Akkad. They ruled over all of the same cities during the same era. Genesis 10 goes on to say, begin quote, Arphaxad, the grandson of Noah, it doesn't say the grandson of Noah, I was just adding that, begot Selah, and Selah begot Eber. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, which literally means division. For in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan, end quote. So maybe sometime about 2200 BC, at the height of Nimrod's empire in the land of Shinar, Peleg is born when God confounded the languages at Babel. Work on the great tower at Eridu, that is Babel, stops, and Nimrod leaves his first kingdom in that land to start another empire. People scatter in all directions, away from Shinar, away from Ur, away from Uruk, away from Eridu, and to this day there are many different languages spoken on the earth. But only 150 years ago, our time, is that mine or yours? Okay. People were still disbelieving the truth of the Bible. The documentary hypothesis was founded on the idea that there is no evidence for the truth of the book of Genesis. How is it that people would choose to believe that the missing fossil evidence for proving evolution would eventually be found, but people would choose not to believe that evidence for the truth of the Bible would ever be found? That's a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to answer it. From the book, Is Atheism Dead? By Eric Metaxas, we read the following, begin quote, in 1901, a Swiss Egyptologist, Gustave Jequier, had the honor of finding it, an 8-foot-tall stela, or pillar, made of black basalt, covered over nearly every inch with cuneiform writing, and crowned with a bas-relief image of a king receiving the law from a god. Comment. This picture shows the top of the pillar on the left with the bas-relief image, and a section of one side on the right. End comment. Once deciphered from the old Akkadian, it was discovered to be a list of 282 laws, which we now know as the famous Code of Hammurabi, an unprecedented list of laws laid down by the Babylonian king. This stela likely stood in Babylon for 6 centuries, but in the 1100s BC was taken as plunder by the Elamites, who hauled it back to Susa, where it lay buried until 1901. What makes it a uniquely valuable find for those wondering whether the Bible is historically accurate is that this stela presents detailed information about life in that part of the world in the 1700s BC. For example, Genesis tells us that regarding inheritance, Abraham's eldest son Ishmael, whom he fathered with the slave Hagar, was nonetheless reckoned to be ranked below his younger brother Isaac, whom Abraham fathered with his wife Sarah. Sure enough, Hammurabi's code tells us that, regarding inheritance, the status of the son of the first wife is above that of the son of a slave, even if the son of the slave was born before the son of the first wife. Comment. But Isaac was born in 2064 BC, 300 years before Hammurabi ruled, so the custom existed long before it was written into law. End comment. Later on in Genesis 37:28, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers for the sum of 20 shekels. Hammurabi's code puts the price of a slave at 20 shekels. Because of this single object discovered in 1901, it becomes impossible to believe that Genesis could have been composed many centuries later, or over 1,000 years later, as some Bible skeptics had been claiming. After all, how could someone know the cost of a slave from a millennium before their time? In his book, Unearthing the Bible, the archaeologist Titus Kennedy explains that earlier ancient codes set the price of slaves lower. For example, the law code of Ur-Nammu from 2050 BC set the price at 10 shekels, and the laws of Eshnunna from 1930 BC set the price at 15 shekels. And at later dates, the price rose to 30 shekels at Ugarit in the 1300s BC and to 50 shekels in Assyria during the 700s BC. We see that what the Bible tells us is a remarkably accurate figure at the time of the Patriarchs. Kennedy also tells us that a trove of tablets found in the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nuzi, first discovered in 1896, similarly referred to many social and cultural customs we find in the patriarchal narrative in Genesis, and also are narrowly particular to that part of the world at that time. It is a curious trend that the more we seem to discover, the more the Bible emerges as an accurate historical record of the events, people, and places it depicts. End quote. I don't know if you can see it, but the cities along the right side of the map over here, starting with Ur at the bottom, are Ur, Babylon, Nuzi, and Shechna. Then you can drop down to the left over here, to get to Haran. It is likely that Terah and Abraham passed through these cities on the way from Ur to Haran. Again, from the book, Is Atheism Dead? We read, begin quote, "From the beginning of the 1800s AD, when such things began to be questioned, the stories of Abraham, and indeed the very existence of Ur of the Chaldees, were read with skepticism. Then in 1849, William Kennett Loftus found the site that previous travelers had mentioned and published a description of the ziggurat. So J.P. Taylor, British vice consul at Basra, began excavation at the site in 1853. After he had found a number of inscribed clay cylinders and bricks, he confidently identified the site as the fabled Ur of the Chaldees, the home of the great patriarch Abraham. And so another fabled world from the ancient scriptures was pulled from the sand and into the present." End quote. In the DVD, True You number 2, Is the Bible Reliable? Dr. Meyer explains, begin quote, "Several classes of external archaeological evidence have shown that the documentary hypothesis is untenable because the evidence situates the narratives in the Middle Bronze Age." That's from 2000 to 1550 BC, end quote. These classes of evidence include, number one, covenants and social customs. At Shechna, an archive of tablets confirms that the 5-part covenants used in Genesis were used in the Middle Bronze Age, whereas late Bronze Age covenants had 7 parts, not 5. Number two, law codes indicating slave prices are the same as those found in the Bible. Number three, personal names like Abraham, Abram, Israel, Esau, Job, Noah, Laban, and Jacob were common in the Middle Bronze Age, but were not common later. Number four, place names like Ur, Haran, Hebron, Sodom, Gomorrah, Laish, Salem, and Shechna are verified. Number five, existence of nationalities like the Amorites and Hurrians are verified. I don't know why you mentioned Hurrians, because I can't find them in the Bible anywhere. So, number 6, 7, and 8, patterns of nomadism, climate, and political conditions are also validated by archaeology and show that the biblical accounts are true and accurate. The evidence that men used camels, shown here from 2000, which I believe is on your left, to 2200 BC, contradicts the idea that camels were not used before 1000 BC, like some people said. Dr. Meyer concludes that, begin quote, this evidence situates the origin of the text close to the time of the events it describes, contradicting the documentary hypothesis about the origin of the Torah, end quote. From the book, Is Atheism Dead? Begin quote, as scholars in the early 1800s AD began to make their case against the historical accuracy of the Bible, the non-existence of the Hittites came to be Exhibit A. It is interesting that Hittites appear throughout the Bible, bespeaking a far-flung existence in time and geographical space, too. The first mention comes in Genesis 23 when Abraham purchased what is known as the Cave of the Patriarchs from a Hittite named Ephron. The Bible also says that the grandson of Abraham and Sarah, Esau, married 2 pagan Hittite women despite a strong disapproval of his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. We encounter the most famous Hittite in the story of King David's adultery with Bathsheba, who was then married to one of his officers, known only as Uriah the Hittite. And I've left out about 3 or 4 other things that he mentioned about Hittites in the Bible. You can look it up on your tablet or whatever. The Bible portrayed the Hittites as a vast empire with tremendous power stretching through the centuries, but where had they gone to? Their non-existence was so complete that in 1861 the Encyclopedia Britannica devoted a scant 8.5 lines to them, and this was only a polite summary of what the Bible said about them, end quote. But throughout the 1800s AD, language experts kept running into evidence for them and finally deciphered enough to confirm that these hieroglyphic carvings were from the Hittite Empire, begin quote. So we know that the Hittites existed, and in such height and breadth as the greatest of any civilizations, but the Bible alone held their name aloft throughout the darkness of 3 millennia, that's 3,000 years, until at long last the new fields of archaeology and philology, which is the science of language, could catch up with it. Those who clung to the Bible as a source of inerrant truth in all matters, whether geographical or historical or other, had in the story of the Hittites been vindicated once more, end quote. In the Bible, the name Hittite is used about 48 times from Genesis through Ezekiel. But turning the pages of the Bible, I want to move down to Genesis chapters 18 and 19 and look at the account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In chapter 18, 3 men appear to Abraham and promise that he will soon have a son by Sarah. And as the 2 men leave, God stays and talks with Abraham about Sodom. Genesis 18, verse 20, and the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord, end quote. Then Abraham talks, I'm summarizing here, Abraham talks to God and gets him to agree to not destroy the cities if there were only 50 or 45, 40 or 30, 20 or even 10 righteous people there. Verse 33, quote, so the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. Genesis 19:1, now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom, and he said, here now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house, and they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them, that is, rape them. So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly, end quote. Now I'm going to give you a quick summary of Genesis 19, verses 8 through 22. Begin summary. Lot offers to give his 2 daughters to the people outside instead of his 2 guests, but they tell him, now we will do worse to you than to them. But the angels jerk Lot back into the house, slam the door, and strike the men outside blind so they cannot find the door. Then the angels tell Lot to go get his sons-in-law, and he tries, but they think he's joking. So the next morning the angels grab the hands of Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters and drag them out of town and tell them to run for their lives to the mountains without looking back. But Lot whines and says, that's too hard and dangerous. Can't he just go to the little town of Zoar instead? So the angels say, okay, end summary. The Bible doesn't really say he whines, but if you read it, that's sure what it sounds like. Verse 23, the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew those cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt. When Abraham is looking toward Sodom, he's 40 miles away, and he can see the smoke of the whole place going up. Let's look at the evidence. I'm going to use color images from the National Geographic DVD, Buried Secrets of the Bible with Albert Lynn, Sodom and Gomorrah, and black and white images and text from the book Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. This picture is a map of the archaeological sites in the Kikar Plain to the north of the Dead Sea in Jordan. By the way, begin quote, the Hebrew term for fertile plains is Kikar, which means disc, and also refers to a loaf of bread baked in a circular or disc shape, end quote. That is why on the map, the southern Jordan Valley, just above the Dead Sea, has a circle around it and is labeled the Kikar. You can see that much on the map. I don't think you can read it. I can't even read it, when I'm really close to it. So, in his book, Eric Metaxas spends many pages reviewing the archaeological history of the search for Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, begin quote, in the latter part of the 1800s, most top biblical and archaeological scholars had believed that the location of these cities must be somewhere northeast of the Dead Sea in what it was called the Kikar Plain. Their location was not disputed, but in the 1900s this changed. That's because a scholar named W.F. Albright and his protege G.E. Wright had, in 1924, confidently and firmly put the location of these cities on the southern edge of the Dead Sea. Their influence and stature in the field of biblical archaeology was such that few would dare to question them, but there were discrepancies and questions. Now, W.F. Albright was called the father of biblical archaeology, so his reputation grew and grew, and people just didn't want to contradict him. In 1996, Dr. Stephen Collins convinced himself that the actual sites of Sodom and Gomorrah were not at the two chosen places in the south of the Dead Sea, but were still undiscovered, and that they would be found northeast of the Dead Sea. Begin quote. He was also aware of the theologically liberal scholars who thought the whole thing was simply an ancient fable. Many scholars didn't believe the Exodus had ever happened, or that Moses was a real person. Many believed that King David was a mythical figure and that the stories of his life were like those of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, end quote. In 2002, he was able to begin investigating these sites in the Kikar Plain, begin quote. It wasn't until the second day that they came to Tel El Hammam. As they were approaching it in their car, they saw that it was breathtakingly large, far larger than they had dreamt. Dr. Collins said it looked like a massive ship riding on a sea of fields. It was stunning, the height of a 9-story building. He wondered, why had no one ever excavated this? As Dr. Collins scoured the area, he found exactly what he found at Tel Nimrin, a remarkable and confounding absence of any pottery from the late Bronze Age, as though during that period alone, both of these once great cities were desolate and unoccupied, end quote. You may not be able to see it, but there is a very large car on the top of this mound in the very center of this picture. Just this side of the excavations. He began excavations in 2005 and the work was slow. Begin quote, it wasn't until the third season of excavation that they had hit what one might well describe as the literal pay dirt for which they had been looking. About 9 feet down, they found a strange, quote, layer of distinct ash-laden, hard-packed soil, unquote. It had not seen the light of day in 37 centuries. And the graduate student digging at that moment, Carol Cobbs, said it still stank of burnt ashes. The acrid smell had been preserved for nearly 4,000 years, 3,700 years. Well, that would be, anyway. Obviously, this was tremendously exciting and offered evidence of what could have been a fiery civilization-ending cataclysm around 1700 BC. I'll talk to you about that date later, it's wrong. Precisely when the Bible indicated, but perhaps even more exciting was what the Bible doesn't say anywhere 1700 BC. It doesn't have dates in it like that, so you have to kind of figure it out. But perhaps even more exciting was what lay just above this layer from 1700 BC. The layer immediately atop this ash-laden layer was from the 10th century BC. This was the extremely strange evidence for which they had been daring to hope. It seemed that this civilization was thriving for many centuries, but then suddenly around 1700 BC, the civilization had stopped dead and then did not start up again for 7 centuries, end quote. Start comment. Please note that while Eric Metaxas accepts a date of 1700 BC, the actual date of the destruction of Sodom, according to the Bible, should be 2065 BC, end comment. Resume quote. In the book, Discovering the City of Sodom, the 2013 book that Dr. Collins and his co-writer, Dr. Latane C. Scott, eventually wrote to tell us this extraordinary story, they explain that the layer of hard-packed ash and destruction debris from the terminal Middle Bronze Age stratum is between 18 inches and 6 feet deep. Embedded in those layers, they write, are unbroken and tumbled mud bricks, smashed and charred pottery vessels, and other day-to-day objects and human bones, all violently churned into a telltale ashy matrix. Whatever happened left behind a wake of destruction unlike anything anyone had ever seen. There was literally nothing to compare with it. And this picture is of the broken jars in this ash layer that they're digging out. In a more recent report from 2019, that's only 3 years ago, they described it similarly with the following words. The matrix had every predictable material in it: pieces of mud bricks, chunks of charred wood, cobble-sized stones and pebbles, pieces of plaster, pottery shards, and a variety of objects. But the mixed matrix did not have a typical gravity order to it. One excavator gave it a descriptive name, the Cuisinart effect. Indeed, the matrix composition had the look of having been thrown into a blender. End description. What is even more staggering about the violence is how widespread it is, for this bizarre 7th century gap is not limited to Sodom, but extends to all of the surrounding cities and towns in the Kikar region. Archaeologists in this region call it the Late Bronze Gap, but Collins explains that this Bronze Age gap only includes the cities and towns in the Kikar Plain. Everywhere else beyond that, civilization continued along uninterrupted in any way. One measure of the devastation comes to us from the archaeologists who excavated Tel Nimrin, which Collins now believes is biblical Admah. They did this excavation in the 1980s and 1990s. They found Middle Bronze wall foundations, the deep-sunk large bases which were intended to anchor the superstructures of the buildings inside the perimeter of the city, but they found no Middle Bronze residences, none of the typical 18-inch thick walls of domestic dwellings. They said this was highly unusual. So what sort of force could possibly tear away walls that thick across an entire city, leaving almost no trace of them and leaving only the foundations below? What in the world could have happened to cause such sweeping destruction? Another clue to what happened came to Carol Cobbs the day she was down in the shaft where she discovered the layer of ash. While digging, her trowel hit something hard within the ash. It was a piece of pottery about the size of her palm, but when she turned it over, she and Dr. Collins saw that the other side was covered or glazed with a greenish glass-like surface. Since glass melts at about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, the glaze could only mean that the shard had been subject to the heat of that temperature. But when one of the volunteers, Dr. Gene Hall, finally saw it, he had another thought, saying it looked exactly like trinitite, end quote, which was the name given to the sand that had melted into green glass under the heat of the first atomic bomb tests in the New Mexico desert. Begin quote. When he got back to the States, Collins had the shard tested at the U.S. Geological Survey Lab. When the geochemist Nelia Dunbar saw it, she immediately said, "Nice piece of trinitite," but when she turned it over, she saw that it was a piece of ancient pottery, so of course it couldn't be trinitite. 12 hours of tests later, they got new information. They could clearly see that the glassy material had not dripped onto the pottery, but was actually the pottery itself melted. The interior of the ceramic, at some point, very briefly, had reached at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Another source says that it reached a temperature 4 times the heat of the sun. The more they talked about what might have caused this, the more they realized every suggestion must be rejected, except maybe one. The only one that seemed to fit is an intense airburst event. What they're pointing to here in these two pictures is the melted face of this. I think this is a piece of mud brick, and it melted and started to drip down. And it's the brick itself, it isn't a layer of anything on top of it. So insert comment. The next 3 pictures show a much smaller airburst event recorded by a dash cam. I think it was in Russia. And what it looked like is this asteroid coming across the sky, and it blows up, and then it continues on down. Continue quote. He's talking about airburst events. These have happened on the other parts of the globe where a meteor or asteroid penetrates the Earth's atmosphere but explodes before it makes contact. That is precisely what happened in 1908 in Tunguska, Siberia. Nearly 1,000 square miles of forest, 80 million trees were incinerated and flattened in an instant by the force of the detonation. People hundreds of miles away were knocked off their feet from the shock waves, and the meteorological disturbance was so great that all across Asia and Europe the night sky was lit up for 3 days. People in London could read newspapers at midnight. That impact event has been estimated to be the equivalent of 15 megatons of TNT or 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. And yet this inconceivably destructive event would only have required a single small asteroid of about 300 feet in diameter, exploding 5 miles above the Earth's surface, end quote. So while investigating the site at Tel El Hammam, Sodom, there appeared to be a circular depression in the ground just to the south and west of the ancient city, in between the city and the Dead Sea. You can see a kind of dull brown circle in the foreground of this picture. Doing a computer enhancement of the site made the depression appear to be more like an impact crater. It looks green in this picture. It looks like a circular, kind of a hollow place. If a meteor broke up into separate parts, this is a generic drawing, and if one of those asteroid parts detonated just above the Dead Sea, then the shock waves could very well have created a tsunami or tidal wave, pushing a large amount of salt over the entire Kikar Plain, poisoning it, which would have killed all the vegetation for hundreds of years. And it would not at all be the first time that God has used so-called natural forces like the 3-year drought in the time of Elijah, or the armies of Assyria or Babylonia to enforce his justice. It is not wrong for scientists to uncover natural causes for specific disasters, but when God is calling the shots and he tells us that he did it, it is wrong to deny that he had anything to do with it. And I know if you remember back, you've probably heard the stories of people who try to explain how the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea, and we'll get to that in future classes, and they say, well, it was just really a sea of reeds and the water was only a few inches deep, and they, just walked across it. And that isn't true, but people try to come up with explanations for which they can use to deny what the Bible says. Okay, I'm running 5 minutes fast. You cannot always trust what people write in books. Eric Metaxas repeated several times that the dates for Abraham and the destruction of Sodom was 1700 BC, but he was wrong. He also says that Solomon's temple was completed in 957 BC, and I've seen that date before, and if it is indeed correct, which I think it probably is, we can calculate the date of the destruction of Sodom by using the Bible. The Bible says that they started building the temple 480 years, 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt, 1 Kings 6:1, and that it took them 7 years to finish building it. That's 1 Kings 6:38. 6 verse 38. I shouldn't look at that screen. It took 7 years to complete the construction of the temple, 1 Kings 6:38. They started building the temple 480 years from the date of the Exodus of Egypt, 1 Kings 6:1. The children of Israel were in Egypt for 430 years, Exodus 12:40 and 41. And what I'm doing is going back in time, saying here's a period of time from the start to end. Here's a period of time from start to end. Okay. Jacob was 130 years old when he stood before Pharaoh at the beginning of their stay. That's in Genesis 47:9. Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. It's in Genesis 25:36. And God promised that Isaac would be born next year in Genesis 18:10, the day before he destroyed Sodom in 2065 BC. It's simple addition. So rather than 1700 BC, if you take the year that Sodom was destroyed to be 2065 BC, and you calculate a 700-year civilization gap over the Kikar Plain, then people would have been rebuilding the region in the year 2065 BC minus 700 years equals 1365 BC, which is only 41 years after Joshua crosses the Jordan in 1406 BC to conquer Canaan. So it looks like Israel may have been responsible for the rebuilding on the Kikar Plain. Anyway, that is all I have to give you today. Do you have any questions? I guess I read it too fast. Thank you for coming. Say again.
Lloyd Leather has a nosebleed, so they will not be here. I just thought maybe we might have a prayer for him.
Yes. Lloyd Leather has a nosebleed and they will not be here today. So if you would, bow with me. Father in heaven, we thank you that we can come here today and look at evidence for the fact that the Bible is true. We pray, Father, that you would help Lloyd Leather and help him to recover from the nosebleed. And we ask, Father, that you would enable them to be here with us again next week. In Jesus' name, amen.